Let's start this week with some really good news. I've got my D850 back. Get in! It came back to me much quicker than I was expecting. All in 4 weeks repair, which is way quicker than I anticipated with the initial estimate from Nikon. So I think they've done a fantastic job there actually in getting the camera back to me that quickly. The damage was actually quite severe on the body. It was more than just the eyepiece cracked, so I'm very glad that I actually sent it away and got it repaired. So very relieved to actually have that back now. I can get back to taking some shots. So on this week's vlog, I'm going to focus on capturing star trail images. Now, I'm at the Point of Ayre on the Isle of Man, which is the most northerly point of the island, and you can actually see behind me a lighthouse which I came to on a vlog a few weeks ago. If you want to see that, it's just at the top page now. But back to this week. Frankly, the weather conditions are unbelievable, and that's why I'm here. They're perfect for astrophotography for tonight. There isn't a breath of wind. It's absolutely still. And that is perfect when you're taking astro shots. You don't want your tripod to be moving around at all. Another benefit of the weather today is, look at that sky. It's so crystal clear. There isn't a cloud anywhere to be seen. And that's absolutely essential when it comes to star trail images. You cannot have clouds moving into your scene, particularly if they're slow moving clouds, because essentially what that'll do is it'll create gaps in your star trail exposures, and it doesn't really lend itself to a very effective shot at all. So I'm looking forward to getting started here. These conditions are incredible. The trick with any good astrophotography is you need to get foreground interest into your shots. It's not good enough to just shoot the actual stars themselves. If you shoot the stars alone, quite often your images can look flat, dull, and pretty uninteresting. Plus, I think getting a foreground subject can give the image kind of a bit of earthly kind of context. So for today's shoot, I'm going to put a cute little lighthouse called Winky Lighthouse that sits on the shingle beach here at the Point of Ayre into my shot, and that's going to be the prominent focal point for the actual image. It's a little lighthouse that I've actually shot quite a few times before, and I quite enjoy taking pictures of it, but I've never tried shooting it in this context before. The other key component to getting effective compositions with star trail images particularly is you need to actually understand how the stars are going to move through the sky. It's not really good enough to just randomly shoot and hope for the best. Sure, you'll still capture those trails, but it may not work within the wider composition that you're going for. So the key thing that I find is you need to locate pole star or north star. Once you've located that, then you can kind of work out what all the other stars in the sky are roughly going to do. For this particular shot, I'm going to try and position pole star in a prominent place within the actual image, potentially actually just above the actual lighthouse itself. I think this will give a really nice effect of the stars almost kind of like spiraling round the lighthouse. I've tried this before and it can work very effectively. To actually locate pole star, it's pretty easy. You just need to find the Big Dipper in the sky, or the plough, which I think it's sometimes called. And the North Star doesn't sit too far from that. I think it's from the right hand side of the actual constellation. You just need to follow that up and it'll take you to Pole Star. It's not too bright in the sky, but generally if you're shooting quite wide, you'll get it if you shoot in that general direction. Oh yeah, if you're in the Southern Hemisphere, I've got no idea what you do. I think you just have to Google that one. So what actually are star trails? Well, when you think about it, as the Earth spins on its axis, each fixed point of light, which is the star, will essentially move through the sky. So with a star trail image, you're essentially creating exposure long enough to pick up that movement during the time of the exposure. So essentially the trail is just plotting the journey that that star has taken during that image. Essentially the degree of movement you get entirely depends on how long the exposure is, but it also depends on what part of the sky you shoot at. The closer you get to the pole star, the smaller the degree of movement. The further away you get from the pole star, the greater the degree of movement within a given time. So for tonight's shot, I'm going to use my Samyang 14mm 2.8. which is an absolute beast when it comes to astrophotography. It's so wide, which is really perfect for capturing those kind of epic night skies, but also the 2.8 aperture lets in a huge amount of light, which really is absolutely fundamental when it comes to any astro shot. The only thing to be wary of is a manual focus lens, but frankly autofocus is kind of out of the question whenever you're shooting astro shots. The key thing to be wary of is you've just got to learn where the actual focal points are on the lens, particularly where infinity is. So in terms of settings for tonight's shoot, I am shooting at f2.8 to let in the maximum amount of light possible. I'm also shooting at about a shutter speed of about 20 seconds, which you're probably a tad confused by, but I'll explain all very shortly. And my ISO is at about 2000. The funny thing with star trail shots is you don't actually need all that many stars to get really effective images. You can get very effective shots with a small number. This means that shooting on full moon nights or in urban environments where you've got a degree of light pollution doesn't actually present that much of a problem. You can still get really effective shots. So on to the next part of settings, and this is the element of settings which tends to wrong foot and confuse a lot of people when they come to first shooting star trail images. Essentially you've got two options. Option one is to get everything in one super long exposure. So the longer your exposure, the more movement you're going to get through the sky of the stars, which means longer trails. Generally, I wouldn't recommend shooting anything less than about 30 minutes. I personally tend to shoot hour or maybe even 2 hours on my actual star trail shots. Whilst this method is quite simplistic and sounds quite appealing, the downside is I tend to find you get way more noise in that super long exposure. So I've tried this in the past and I tend to stay well clear of this method now. The second method is essentially taking shorter exposures at regular intervals over the full duration and exposure you're going for. So if you were trying to get an hour-long exposure, you could, using this method, take 60 one-minute exposures to give you your 1 hour exposure. This method is the method that I personally use because I think it delivers better results with less noise. It sounds a little bit more complicated, but I'll talk you through later in the video how in post-processing you can actually compile all of these multiple images together to get an effective result. So tonight I am shooting using the interval timer setting on my camera. I'm shooting shutter speeds of 20 seconds and then I'm shooting those at intervals of 25 seconds. That means between each 20-second image there is a 5-second pause before it starts the next one, and I've lined up a total of 160 of these images to go off, and the camera will continue shooting these until it gets to the end of that sequence. With the interval timer setting, you have to make sure that your interval is longer than your actual shutter speed, because if it's not, then the whole thing will just break immediately. There's got to be short pause in between each shot. This will allow the camera to process and write the image to the memory card. Generally, I work at about 5 seconds. I think this gives the camera enough time to settle itself down, ready for the next image without any kind of buffer issues with writing the shots. You don't want to make that little pause between the images too long, however, because if they're too long, what you'll effectively get is tiny little gaps in between each of the exposures. So this means within your wider trail, it will just look terrible. You'll have tiny little gaps all the way along the trails. So with the settings I've chosen on the interval timer, I've calculated that my total exposure time should be just a touch over 1 hour. So all I've got to do now is sit here and freeze my ass off. It's freezing. This is the boring bit of star trails. There's a lot of sitting around and waiting, and it can't really be avoided. I could go and sit in my car, but I'm a bit too paranoid about leaving my camera out here, so I'm just going to have to sit with it and just wait, essentially. So I've now got my images into Lightroom, and the very first thing that strikes me about this is the white balance just looks horrible. So I think I'm going to cool this down a little bit. I tend to find with astrophotography, white balance is a very subjective thing. Some shots can look better warmer, some can look better cooler. So I tend to leave the adjustment of white balance until I get into post-processing. So yeah, I think that will probably do me for that. I think that looks much better already. I'm going to add a little bit of contrast because I think it just lacks a little bit of punch at the moment. I'm going to draw down the highlights and boost up shadows and whites. Yeah, I think that looks better. I think this really brings the image to life, and I'm going to knock down the blacks. I think that makes the image a lot more punchy. Also going to add a little bit of clarity just to make the image sing a little bit more. I'm going to knock in a little bit of contrast also into the tone curve, which I tend to do in a lot of my shots. Doesn't make a huge great difference, but again I think it just adds that nice little bit of punch to the shot. And finally, I think the vignetting, I just need to just manually counter this a little bit. Automatic modes can be a little bit too aggressive, I find, for astrophotography. I'm really just looking to just make it a little bit more subtle. This image doesn't really need a great deal of editing, so I think that already looks a lot better. Yeah, definitely big difference. So what I'll do now is I will copy this these Lightroom settings essentially to the other 159 images in my sequence, and then we can take the editing from there. So I use a program called StarStax to do my star trail editing, and it's absolutely free, and I will put a link to it into the description for this video. Highly recommend it. You of course can do your processing in Photoshop, but I find this program to be a lot simpler to use. So the first step is to pop in all 160 shots in my sequence into the program. In terms of settings, there's not really too much to the program. I tend to use gap filling, which I believe fills in any micro gaps you may have in your trails. There's comet mode, which can add pretty cool effects. Subtract dark images I only tend to use when I really push the ISO, which I didn't for this shoot. In terms of the actual quality settings, I just run them as high as I can really. And that's about it. I just recommend just have a little play around with it and see what settings kind of suit your style really. That's about it. So when you're ready to go, you start processing, and it will start to actually build your star trail images right in front of your eyes. It's absolutely fantastic. I'm massively pleased how that final image turned out. For me, it totally surpassed my expectations. Star trail images can feel like a lot of work. The capture duration can mean that you have to spend a lot of time outside, and post-processing can seem daunting, but it's really not as bad as you think, and I would thoroughly encourage you all to go out and give it a try. For me, star trail images encapsulate everything that I love about photography. It's showing the everyday world in a totally different light, and you really don't have to be as daunted by it as you think. They're actually more accessible. I hope this insight into my approaches for star trail images proves useful to you. If it has, please subscribe to my channel, and I will see you all soon. Goodbye.